Across my videos, one of the common themes that connects almost every single one of them are gender roles. A gender role is currently defined as a cultural and social determined set of expected behaviors, attitudes, and characteristics based on concepts of masculinity and femininity. The term was coined by John Money, whom I can't seem to avoid mentioning in any of my videos. Given how unnecessary and flawed the term gender is, you would expect similar weaknesses from the term gender roles. But surprisingly enough, gender roles is used as a term, just not with the definition that I gave above. The definition is very much based in Money's ideology and modern pseudoscience around sex, as it is strongly highlighting only social aspects of a gender role. What a gender role would be better defined as would be the social roles, duties, expectations, and behaviors of a certain sex within a society that are based on evolutionary biopsychological characteristics. Now, with someone unfamiliar with the current cultural discussion might think that I didn't really change too much, but yet I made an important distinction, that being the clarification that gender roles stem from biology and millions of years of evolution, not simply a reflection of a given cultural zeitgeist. Since it is a strong claim and a significant change, I wish to support it with the rest of this video. First, we need to debunk and dismantle the old definition to show its inadequacy and justify a new definition. And secondly, we need to bring forward arguments in support of this new definition. Okay, so why is the current definition such an issue? It stems from what is called the tabula rasa, or blank slate, which is the notion that babies are completely blank slate upon their birth and no biological factors influence their life. It's an extremist ideology that only the environment alone shapes the life of a person. Some examples of blank slate include IQ not being hereditary. It's about education. Race differences are a result of systematic racism and not statistically significant differences in averages of biological traits. Sports performance is not about biological advantages. It's just about the amount of training. And of course, sex differences are not inherent. They are taught to children by oppressive social structures, and such views at first glance feel terrifying and frankly absurd. It's true that the environment shapes and guides evolutionary adaptations, but such adaptations take thousands of years, not just a few decades. The fastest known evolutionary adaptations in humans still took thousands of years. In all but one case, they took longer than the history of our known civilization. So the environment does indeed play a role in those things, but only in an extremely, very long term. And how do we know this? Well, let's start from the initial claims. IQ has a known hereditary factor, for one, and attempts to raise IQ in intellectually challenged children have all thus far failed. The Army itself deems it pointless to induct anyone under the IQ of 83 because they found they literally cannot teach such a person anything productive. They do not have the capacity to understand. While access to education might fulfill someone's already present potential and pull them from a lower socioeconomic status, it cannot actually increase their IQ. We only know about things that either decrease IQ, such as lead and sugar, or maintain an IQ, such as exercise and a healthy diet. But as far as we currently know, IQ is not actually increased by access to education. People can only fulfill their genetic potential by getting better education. None of this means that IQ is purely genetic. There is for sure some environmental factor, but there's no denying that to some degree, if not to a large degree, that there is a biological factor. So, what about racial differences? In animals, we know a border collie is on average exceptionally smart and exceptionally athletic compared to other dog breeds. And a greyhound will be genetically faster and a better runner than a pug. But it's considered extremely wrong to apply the same logic to human races. The reason Black people dominate athletic sport is not because all the runners have valiantly beaten systematic racism. It's because they are, on average, born with biological advantages that make it more likely that a person on the extreme elite level will be Black. Those biological traits, which will sometimes present as an advantage and sometimes not. And of course, those are averages. It doesn't mean every member of a race has the same exact traits, but the existence of exceptions does not invalidate a large pattern, and it does not completely invalidate all biological differences. And having disadvantages in one area does not invalidate you as a person either. You have other strengths that others don't have. It's a balance. So naturally, it's the same when it comes to sex. The notion that evolution did absolutely nothing to our psychology and gave us no instincts, especially considering humans are highly social animals, is just completely absurd. There are things that the environment influences, but they have to do with details or structure. The role of society is to guide and structure natural instincts. We know gender roles aren't entirely social because experiments where anyone tried to socially engineer gender roles for children failed miserably. I've talked about this extensively before in one of my other videos, but there is by far no successful experiment that would socially construct a gender for someone, even when it's their life's mission to do so. Countries that have tried their best to eliminate gender differences found that biological sex differences only increase their society. When gender roles are reversed, marriages break down and unhappiness increases for both genders. Feminism needed decades to get even a foothold because women were happy in their semi-traditional arrangements. Anti-feminists were a much more vocal group already early in women's rights movements and all the way up to the late 20th century.
What does International Women's Year mean to you?
I don't know, it doesn't worry me. It don't have any effect, I don't sort of think about it. Do you?
I don't take interest in women's movement. It doesn't worry me at all. I don't like it.
Why don't you like it?
I'd rather be the way I am. I like to be under my husband's thumb.
I reckon the man should wear the pants, He should sort of be the boss in the family, Well, I'd rather him go out to work and earn the money than me go out and earn the money and look after the kids, but I sort of just don't believe in it.
What does International Women's Year mean to you?
Nothing.
Nothing at all.
Nothing.
Has women's liberation affected your life at all?
No. I don't believe in it.
What about equal job opportunity and equal pay and that sort of issue?
Yes, no, I don't quite go with it. I'm afraid I'm old-fashioned, really. I think the man is the important one with jobs and the pay and that sort of thing, don't you, really?
But do you think women's liberation is a good thing?
I'm very sceptical about some of the extremes it's carried to. I think women are in great danger of being dominated by women, being told to liberate themselves by doing what other women want them to do. That, to me, is a great danger.
I don't think it's right for a woman to work and for a man to stay at home.
You don't think it's right?
I don't believe in women's lib.
Why not?
I don't believe in women's lib because from sheer biology, a woman has babies and a woman has to look after a house. I mean, it's more or less impossible for a man to do that.
No, I'm old-fashioned, you see, naturally, and I think a woman's place is in the home looking after her children.
Children come first, and that's about it, really.
I agree, basically. I mean, I wouldn't like to leave him for anybody else to bring up. I don't think that's right. But I enjoy doing my part-time work, and I think once he's at nursery school, I'll go back out and do more part-time. I'll always be at home whenever he's at home.
I just don't like the idea at all. Do you think that it is wrong for women to go out and earn the money and for men to stay at home and look after the family? Yes, definitely. It's bad for his ego.
Do you think that married women in Australia lead an exciting life or a dull life at home?
Oh, most exciting.
Oh, yours is like that?
Yes, I think so.
How do you keep it so?
Oh, entertaining and going out and so on. I think it's lovely.
Never considered going to work?
Good heavens, no.
And the biggest irony of this story is that it was a well-organized, articulate campaign of activist women who engineered the defeat of the ERA. Now, this anti-ERA coalition argued that women already had the freedom they needed. The nasty amendment, they argued, would de-sex society. It would mandate homosexual marriage and unisex restrooms and combat duty for women in the Army. Feminism, they said, would destroy the family.
Feminism needed funding from wealthy elites and hijacked universities' media, political influence, and then mass indoctrinated young girls everywhere and made it mainstream. Even today, most women do not identify themselves as feminists. Many of the most prominent anti-feminist voices today are indeed still women. They aren't the ones brainwashed. After women received voting rights, it took them many decades to even show up to elections. Women didn't really want this. I think that illustrates the immense social pressure it takes to influence biological instincts. So I think the idea of blank slate is very naive and wishful thinking. Furthermore, if gender roles were socially motivated, we would have plenty of example of reversed gender roles, such as female soldiers and breadwinners and male housekeepers and nannies. But we don't know of any such culture ever existing. The closest thing we have to it are matrilineal societies where women inherit property, but gender roles are otherwise the same as they are everywhere else. One of the first feminists to explore this theory was Margaret Mead, and her work has been cited throughout the past century, continuously, to support the new definitions of gender. But Mead's work has been discredited as it seems clear that she didn't spend much time with the Samoans at all, and it was revealed that the Samoans thought her questions were so crazy that they were just entertaining her, as they thought she was stupid and they couldn't think of any answers. The Samoans were quite strongly traditional, and in general, the severe lack of variation across time and space points to gender roles being biological rather than social, as genetics obviously predate culture by millions of years. Blank slate equalism is just as extreme as biological determinism. It fails to account for an obvious present biological factor in humans, and this invalidates the definition of gender roles described and calls for reform to the definition to be more scientifically accurate, as there is a clear biological element. And of course, it is not entirely biological either, because while gender roles and gender norms are similar across civilization, there is still variations, and there are clearly things influenced by culture, such as fashion. So some part of it is social, and some part of it is biological. But exactly how much? Is it only partially biological, mostly biological? What parts are biology and what are not? This is where the answer becomes harder to reach. We certainly have many speculations for the origin of gender roles that come from evolutionary theories, and many of such speculations sound very logical and make a lot of sense, but might be very difficult to actually prove in a scientific sense. For example, it makes sense that due to inherent strength differences between men and women, women tended to be the housemakers and responsible for the social cohesion, and because of that, they developed superior social instincts to men. But can one only experimentally prove this by studying humans or other animals? And if so, how would we know if male strength came first and women's social skills did not come second? Or vice versa. These kind of theories are easy to make, and it's easy to make them and sound sensible, but it's a different story to give definitive proof. In psychology, the measures of genetic heritability of certain traits can vary drastically, which points to them being more socially than biologically influenced. However, this is only true for a handful of traits. Currently, the best way to tell if something is biological rather than social is to first and foremost observe its consistency across human civilization. If that trait is common between many geographical isolated regions across time, it's a pretty good indicator that that is a biological component and it's a stronger trait than a social one. For example, Strength differences. Men have been stronger than women in Europe, in Japan, in rural Mexico, in Australia, and in Africa. Thus, this particular trait doesn't have social influence. Sure, you can train a woman to be stronger than some men, but if a man and a woman are given equal elite training, the man will always come out on top due to biological advantages. Then, once universality is found and biological origin is possible, this is usually supported by Tinbergen's 4 questions that are currently called mechanism, ontogeny, phylogeny, and adaptive significance. Those are big words, but basically, mechanism refers to the purpose of the trait. For this case, for example, men either evolved greater strength to defend against predators and then later to hunt. Ontogeny is the stepwise evolution of the trait. You can see the progression in it. For example, men get slightly stronger over generations and are more likely to survive and defend against invading tribes and pass on their genes, and that strength grows gradually, not instantly. Phylogeny refers to a genetic evidence and tracking back down to our common ancestor. In the case of physical strength, this is quite easy to do by looking down our primate evolutionary line and finding a point where males surpassed females in physical strength. And finally, adaptive significance requires an example for why such a trait would help survival and justify evolution. In this case, a stronger man means he can defend against stronger predators and protect his children, thus greater strength resulting in higher survival. So with universality and the Tinbergen's questions answered, male strength is highly likely a biological trait. Something like fashion has few universal traits and does not serve a purpose and does not have gradual evolution. Thus, it is probably cultural. So, on the example of those 2 traits, we can show the gender roles have biological and social elements. But genders have an endless list of features we could compare, and wide enough studies simply have just not been done for most traits. Some things are consistent, though. For example, openness to casual sex tends to be stronger in men across all cultures. Strength differences, risk-taking, and aggression in men are consistent biological traits. Labor split, like men being hunters and women being the homemakers, is extremely consistent across multiple societies and multiple cultures. Some less consistent traits involve, for example, fashion, and mathematical ability. The most influential work in this sense probably comes from Janet Shibley Hyde, one of the leading academics in gender studies, and a big name in the field of feminist theory. In 2005, she published a large review study that looked at how gender roles and gender differences vary across the world to show how similar the genders really are and how much influence society actually has over the differences between men and women. This is a widely cited and respected study. Janet has received many awards for her life's work in this topic, including the Kinsley Award. Didn't know we have prizes now that are named after pedophiles who forced orgasms on little children, but okay, not the first time our society has ignored pedophilia, I guess. But yeah, her work is respected on this matter, so I guess we'll take a look at what it says. So according to this, 78% of the traits they tested fall into either 0 or low difference, which means that most traits that were previously believed to be very gender different were actually quite similar, such as mathematical and verbal abilities. Only a minority of things were significantly different, such as measures related to throwing and other physical things related to strength and mechanical ability. This was a review of 46 meta-analysis and later updated in 2014 with various theories for why things like this are like this. So case closed, right? The social component is very strong and gender is mostly social. Correct? Well, it's really not that simple. There is a distinction between measuring ability and interest. For one, Hyde specifically measured mathematical ability and other intellectual abilities, but they did not measure interest or real-life performance. When you remove social barriers to profession choice, fewer and fewer women actually choose STEM fields because of biological differences in interest. I have shown something similar before when I showed that men and women have virtually no differences in experiencing emotion. So someone like Hyde might say that this means we're all the same, but we're not, because emotion expression is much stronger in women than it is in men. It is very, very different to either gender, to either sex. Men might feel the same emotions women do, but they treat it as background noise in favor of more logical solutions, while women will lean much more into those emotions and explore those emotions. If you choose to measure a whole slew of factors that have to do with just abilities, yeah, you'll get a lot of similarities, as men and women's brains actually aren't that strongly dimorphic. For example, based on Hyde's research, you could say that because their measures of spatial awareness and intellectual abilities showed no gender differences, there is no reason to believe that the two genders would overall have different driving abilities. But then if you measure the number of accidents overall, women are the safer drivers. If you measure accidents driven by mile, men are the safer drivers because they are driving vastly more than women. And so naturally, they would get into vastly more accidents. If you measure by serious accidents, women are the safer drivers. If you measure by small accidents, like bumping a car in a parking lot, men are the much safer drivers. And if you measure how driving abilities relate to gender equality, personality differences only increase. And for example, risk-taking differences further increase with more gender equality and persist through any methods of trying to equalize these results, pointing to risk-taking in men being a biological trait rather than a social one. And you could do this kind of breakdown for every one of Hyde's points. It really matters a lot what specific factor you are measuring. I can't speak for Hyde whether she deliberately cherry-picked the factors of if this was honestly the research and at the time. I didn't go through all the studies for this video. Maybe I can do that in the future sometime if you guys want us to. But I can't say that even if everything here is legit, it's really far from the whole story, and it can't be taken as a concluded fact. It can be taken as a factor, but I would not be taking it as a fact. Another point is that in social sciences, the measure of Cohen's d can be quite misleading, as even small differences can matter a lot in society. For example, I've also shown before that many of the big 5 personality traits have a lot of overlap between men and women. But even such visually insignificant differences can mean a lot on the societal level. So while Hyde's research is technically not presenting false results, they are quite misleading when you consider what kind of measurements were chosen and how blanket applied the statistics were, without considering that a small difference in mathematics is not necessarily a small difference when applied to humans. In real life, even small and insignificant differences like a rounding error can lead to accidents or danger. So I would say this highlights a need to determine what is a small difference in the case of human subjects compared to mathematics. Another popular theory in feminist circles is the sex role theory, introduced by feminist Eagly and Wood in 1999. This theory is fundamental to women's studies and cites the patriarchy, of course it does, and the wage gap throughout history as the reason women had no choice but to evolve and adapt to domestic roles. Basically, it argues that society forced evolutionary change through thousands of years of the patriarchy rather than evolutionary differences causing said social norms. However, even this paper tried to analyze existing large databases at the time, only to find that the men did in fact prefer younger, beautiful, fertile women, and the women did in fact prefer high-earning provider husbands. Most of this is just philosophy with little experimental proof in it, but somehow it was accepted into academia. Shocking. Probably because the conclusions sounded nice. I mean, if the wage gap and patriarchy are your arguments, that kind of puts your whole paper into question. And the glaring issue is this. as I showed earlier, human evolution is incredibly slow, and these miniature adaptations took even longer than the entire history of human civilization that we know about. Genetics vastly predate culture. Genetics drove our lives for millions of years before society even existed and culture was even invented. Obviously, it makes more sense that we evolved culture based on our genetics and not the other way around. This brings us to the other side of the argument. I mentioned the feminist paper analyzed data from BUS that looked at male preferences in 37 different countries. So clearly, data on biological origins exists. Yes, it's academically considered outdated because Western society has changed oh so much in the last decade or so, and those studies would have to be conducted again. But is anyone funding such studies today? No. Universities will actively discourage research into biological differences between men and women, except feminist studies that try to strawman the old arguments as much as they can and try to debunk them. For example, in the Dr. Anna video, I showed an article that claimed mate preferences didn't have so much differences between the gender, but they reduced mating to only one factor for each gender, as if, for example, a girl's age is the only thing men are looking for in a partner. Of course, such a reductionist view is not true, but okay, so all the available data is old, and new research is very, very hard to come by and unofficially illegal in the academic world. Yet, studies like Hyde study and Eagles and Wood study, they exist. So, according to academia, we can conclude that biological origins of gender roles are unproven pseudoscience, which makes a scientific argument extremely difficult. So, were the older studies really that lackluster? After all, the feminists themselves had to admit that the gender differences persisted even when they desperately tried to destroy them. It's solid data, it's just old. Similar to the Sex and Culture book by Unwin, which was written 100 years ago and is thus seen as archaic. But people have noticed modern society perfectly follows his predictions. Has any academia investigated this to see if this work is still relevant? Not to my knowledge. I couldn't find any academic analysis in the recent decades. Furthermore, the vast majority of traits that we find that are different between men and women have not been investigated cross-culturally to confirm the source of those differences. But the old data is really good data, and it still persists to this day. It's still great quality. BUS found mate preferences persist across all cultures. So did the feminists. Male aggression was found to be a biological trait in even the later research also done by feminists. Physical strength differences are perhaps the most obvious example as well. Clearly, we have biological differences. BUS himself revised his study twice with his colleagues, including the study of 45 different countries in 2020, which confirmed previous data in this review in 2015 that found a sex overlap of only 20%, and from just mate preferences alone, the participants' sex could be correctly determined over 90% of the time, showing great predictive power. But other such data, there isn't much research into other gender differences. However, there is a bit of hope. This massive data set from the last year could hold some new information. This enormous survey of 175 countries done by over 400 researchers in 45 languages tested over 100,000 participants for an extremely wide array of variables, but the article very strongly resists any discussions, conclusions, or implications from the data and only posted the raw measurements, which are vast and extensive. Currently, nobody has gone through the data to plot it and present the actual results. I downloaded the Excel file, but plotting data from 100,000 participants and analyzing so much is beyond what I can do just in my free time. If any institution wants to fund me doing this, contact. But otherwise, I will leave this to some group of researchers to sift through and see whose theory it actually supports. But this database, it's there. It can be found on the Open Science website here, and hopefully soon we can get some answers from this. But this is the last thing published on this topic that we have as of right now. So, where does that leave us with the initial question? Well, we've established some things are biological and some are cultural. Women might naturally be less interested in math, for example, but there's no reason to assume women actually have less mathematical ability. The perceived difference in ability can simply come from lack of interest, which leads to lesser knowledge, lesser focus, and more mistakes. Those things go hand in hand. And while we do not have the exact numbers or even an estimate how much of our behavioral differences are biological or cultural, we do know for a fact that both of those factors exist. However, I feel more inclined to side with the evolutionary perspectives. We can observe the same patterns across the entire animal kingdom. The fact that seahorses are such a famous exception to an otherwise universal rule that they always like to bring up for some reason shows that biology does have a large hand in gender roles. And if every other animal performs their gender roles purely on instinct, why would we assume humans have evolved zero instincts to push us into our specific gender roles throughout all of history? Or on the other end, does socialization also affect animals? Well, scientists have been trying for decades to change the gender roles of animals with no success. A rooster will not brood eggs, for example. We have been unsuccessful in training animals to perform actions of the opposite sex, unless we change their hormone structure, aka influence their biology, their physical being. Only when hormones in animals were drastically changed did the animals adopt new behaviors. But aside from such ethically questionable practices, there seems to be a hard wall in what animals will learn, and this directly shows that socialization does not influence biology. As you know, I've talked many, many times about other examples of failed socialization in humans as well. So we can say that the biological factor is at least very strong. The fact that we observe so little major differences in gender roles across human history speaks to how innate certain behaviors are to us. Looking at statistics at face value is one thing, but we also need to take a step back and observe the bigger picture. Gender roles are incredibly consistent. In a world of millions of species, there are only a handful that break the rules. Socialization doesn't work on other social animals. Why would it work so drastically differently on humans? Even when it's tried on humans, it fails. In the end, I believe that the biological programming exists in all of us, and the job of society is only to lead to the expression of those traits. I don't know, men might have biological provisioning instincts. Society can lead to express that instinct via childcare expectations or dating courtship rules or financial motivations for men in order to provide. There might be some sort of societal pressure there, but largely I think that doesn't change the core of the biological programming that men want to provide. And if at least until we have better data, or at least until we can actually talk about it openly, I think having the perspective of evolution being the main driving force is the most rational one to have. We are part of the animal kingdom no matter how much we try to separate ourselves from it. Exceptions to this rule will of course exist, but tearing down structures that work for the majority of people is destructive to society, and instead of trying to change who we are, let us first understand who we are. Anyways, that was my video on the gender role issue. Hopefully I provided some nuance and understandable takes into the subject. That was a fun one. Anyways, I welcome discussion in the comments, and I hope to see you in the next video. Cheers!